provide some nice questions and thought discussions for this group. So the first topic, and I'll turn to Andrew first to see if he can jump in and provide his thoughts, is a question that is seemingly a basic question, or at least it should be, but I get this question from founders all the time. The more I think about it, it's a difficult question. Is how do you go about in determining the valuation of your company? We all know if you look online, talk to people, it's pretty easy to get there for a mature company with revenue, but how do you go about valuing an idea, or just something that's really just a thought at the point, maybe some technology that you know can get there, but will take some time to get there. And Andrew, what are your thoughts on how to help folks get to that valuation number, and how do you negotiate with investors? And I think we should think about not just the dollars itself, but what are the implications? What are the things that you should be thinking about when negotiating with the investor side?
Yeah, so I'll be interested to hear what David has to say about this in particular. I think that obviously, depending on how it developed your technologies at the time that you were doing this valuation, is quite critical to this calculation. I think that, in my experience, usually the technologies that I'm part of is something that's relatively new, licensed out of an academic academic institution here in Boston, typically MIT or Harvard. And what I've found over the 4 or 5 different companies that I've been involved in, some of their other early stage deals that I've been part of, is there's probably more of an art than the science to it, but it seems to be that, to me, somewhere in the sweet spot of $5 to $10 million is typically these pre-money valuations, and then you do a deal, and then you've got to think through how much capital is going to be needed for the company, because people will, at my current company, for instance, they're thinking about post-money and how much is needed to develop the asset, and then they don't want to overshoot it and have it be too valuable by the time they have funded it and not be able to fundraise again. So, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's one of those things where I think that if it's too high in the beginning, you'll find that you'll take it later in another round. So I'm not sure, if the battle is such that I want to, you're thinking to yourself, well, I really want to maximize the valuation now, you might find that you're fighting that same battle at the next round. So it's just worth thinking through the whole sequence and the capital requirements needed.
So there's an old saying, what's something worth? It's worth what a willing buyer will pay and what a willing seller will part with it for. So when you're doing venture valuations, it's very different from, as Andrew just pointed out, where a valuation is derived in a more mature company or more mature asset. You're not talking about things like cash flow multiples as you would be if you were looking at a roll-up or an acquisition. And there is always context. Valuations ebb and flow based on how much capital is chasing what deals. And it is a little bit of art, but the science to it is, as you're going out to raise capital, having some understanding of what some of the comparable deals are that are getting done, okay? And as Andrew just pointed out, you kind of got to be close. I would put something in reverse from what Andrew just said, which is, well, it's kind of valuation in this range, and then figure out what you need. What I always like to do and encourage entrepreneurs to do is think backwards. Go to your goal and say, because at some levels this can be an acid test that says we're not going to get this done. This is not going to be fundable. Go to your goal and say, here's what the enterprise valuation looks like when we get this thing to cash flow, break even, and growth. That's the point at which you don't necessarily need to raise capital because you're going to run out of capital. You've got a self-sustaining entity. Then you work backwards and you say, what are the stages of activity and proof that need to be accomplished between where we are at point A and at our goal. What's that going to require in terms of functional elements? What's that going to require in terms of capital? And then you make those correspond to the different stages of capital you're going to have to raise. There are different expectations of different investors in different rounds. Your early investors understand, okay, my MO is to be enabling somebody to take a science experiment and prove concept. The next stage can be, okay, we're going to develop that out further, take the prototype and get it into something that is closer to commercialization. So you need to understand what are those bands, what needs to be proven on what amount of capital. And then you can back into, okay, here are some of the deals that are getting done. The other thing that I would caution very carefully is in terms of valuation. When you're negotiating a term sheet with an entrepreneur, or at least for me, it's a very important part of the due diligence. Can you work with this person? And if that person is going to get into an argument about a valuation where we're splitting microns, like a couple of guys wrestling each other for a crust of bread on the sidewalk, that's not somebody I want to work with. So I would say keep it in perspective and understand how you are going about that negotiation is important as diligence about how you're going to be to work with. And that means come in prepared, and if you have comparables to say this is what we think this is based on, that helps. That shows you're prepared. You've done your homework. If you are laying out what you think the enterprise is going to need in capital over its life and backing into, but here's what we want to accomplish on this first round of investment, that's going to go a long way. That says you're prepared, you've thought it through. And then if you're close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades relative to the market, it goes a long way. And an important aspect to remember is if you are indispensable as the driver of the company, if you're off a little bit in terms of valuation relative to what you should have, there are lots of opportunities with things like option pools that enable your board and investors to say, you know what, that CEO is knocking the cover off the ball, and we ought to be granting some additional options to make up for an earlier valuation disparity.
And Jonathan, maybe you could talk a little bit more about with what you have the valuation, what are the other provisions that you might worry about tied to valuation, such as anti-dilution and liquidation preferences, and what those typically look like today and what we're seeing in the market?
Sure, yeah, I think that certainly the first thing that I'll encourage you to think about when they're talking about going out to fundraise is going to be the valuation, but if you look at a typical term sheet, there'll be several pages that include a lot more than just what is the bottom line number, dollars per share. You're going to be looking at a lot of provisions around control of the company, the percentage of the company that's going to be sold, and then some more sort of follow-on nitty-gritty provisions around further decision-making, control of decisions around whether to sell the company, whether to go and fundraise again, whether to go public. There's a number of these sorts of weedsy issues that you can really go to rabbit hole to think about, but I think one thing that we try to counsel entrepreneurs to do is to step back and think about, when is this provision going to take effect in my company, and how many steps down the road do I have to go before that becomes relevant to my business? And do I want to spend my time thinking about those issues today, or do I want to spend time thinking about the things that will happen next week or before the next fundraising round? Bearing in mind that what you do today sets some precedent for what happens down the road, and so you don't always get a chance to negotiate completely from scratch, but you do have more chances to massage things in the direction that you want them to go, and to work with your investors and your partners really to make that happen and to make it work right for your company. And I think one thing that's very important to recognize is that these all are not distinct issues truly from the valuation either. These are all part and parcel of the negotiation for bringing your financing round to a close. And so I think it's one thing that we really try to come back to is, that the point that David was making earlier is that it's really how you work with these investors and how you can come together to produce a partnership that really works for the company going forward. And I think one thing that I wanted to put to both of you is, there's this tension that we see between, when you're going out to a fundraise, you're setting a valuation for your company. David, as you said, you're going to be thinking about the stages from the, being self-sustaining all the way back to today, and how many steps does it take to get there. And there's always going to be a tension between setting that valuation, choosing how much of your company you're willing to part with on an equity percentage basis in order to get enough cash to meet the runway that you believe you need to get to that next stage. And there's always going to be tension between, do I take a higher valuation and more cash today, and that makes it more secure that I get to the next stage, versus, well, I've given away more of my company at that point, I've set a higher bar for valuation at the next round, and I have to really be sure that I can hit a high target before that can happen. And I'm just kind of curious to get both of your thoughts on, how much of that decision is art, how much is science, and where would you think that the lean should be? Do you lean more towards getting more cash in the door, which I think is a lot of people's initial assumption, or do you lean more towards being a little more conservative in valuation and making sure that you can hit those targets that you're setting, and maybe relying more on your existing investors to fill the gap if you can't quite get it to the next round?
Great questions. I would separate the capital you need for the valuation, because I think those are, although they're related questions, they are distinct and separate questions. And I think you need to first be very unflinching about looking at what you need and what you're going to accomplish. Because it doesn't do you, the entrepreneur, any good whatsoever, and it actually puts you in a really terrible position in terms of not only your own credibility, but also your vulnerability later on. If you get too cute about saying, I don't need as much money, or I'm going to get too cute about being skimpy about the valuation, about the capital I take, and then coming up short, and then raising money when you really need it. And I think the technical term for the position in which you find yourself then is screwed. So I would err generally on the side of being very realistic about what you need capital for, but understanding, look, things go wrong, and there are things that are both within your control and not in your control that go wrong. And you need to be realistic about building in a buffer. Whether an experiment goes wrong, whether it takes a little longer to get some feedback from FDA or CMS or whatever you can have as an external gating factor to your forward progress. The flip side is that if an investor is too monomaniacally focused on maximizing, obviously you want somebody who's motivated to maximize valuation, but there's a sort of a continuum, and it's kind of like, I don't remember which Supreme Court justice said, pornography is hard to define, but you know it when you see it. You see the same thing in certain behaviors. And if somebody is so focused on, I don't want to give up 2% more in my company, that sends off a bad message. It sends off a message that this person is insecure about the ability to build the venture and add value, and does not want to see the venture investor as a partner, okay? So that's, I think there's a little bit of a cautionary tale there. So I think you end up not only on valuation, but on other terms. There's market context to that. If you're going out and facing a market where it's really difficult to raise a B or a C round, you're going to see different terms. You're going to see the investors coming in, and they're going to be putting in things that, multiple liquidation preferences. They may, to put your earlier investors' feet to the fire, put in things that maybe aren't as relevant to you, but do create tension in the process, pay-to-play provisions saying, earlier investors need to come back to the table or they're going to get washed off the cap table. And, but those things ebb and flow. A lot of the terms, the other thing that I think people really obsess about are issues of control. A lot of this stuff, and I would encourage everybody to go to the NVCA website, and a lot of people are moving toward getting uniform documents that are sort of the NVCA approved forms. In reality, they're not a lot different from the forms that people at McDermott are going to come out with, or Ropes, or wherever. But there is a lot less mystery to some of the provisions. And investors are going to expect certain things. They're going to expect to get their money back first. That's very reasonable. The question is whether they get multiples of their money back first or not. They're going to have some provisions that build in a return in terms of dividend, an ability to put their stock back to the company. You need to think about the different scenarios in which things apply. If things have sort of gone sideways, it's a lot more difficult than if the company crashes and burns or does great. So some of those are really, it's helpful to have lawyers who can explain the significance of some of these things. The things that I think we all, and particularly entrepreneurs and particularly less experienced entrepreneurs, tend to just jump on like pit bulls is, oh my God, I need to control. I got to have a majority and therefore control. This is my company. Again, some of those things are going to send off messages to your investors that you need to manage. The fact of the matter is, for everybody, including the venture investor who is typically not buying a control stake, it's all about how well you're working together and what influence you exert. So at some level, sort of free yourself from the notion of control, accept the fact that there are certain things that your investors are just going to insist on. If you want to sell the company, you require your investors to say, okay, if certain things as to which there are protective provisions come in, that's part of the game.
Thanks, David. And Andrew, as far as fundraising goes, and you've raised a couple $1 million in your seed or Series A, when do you start thinking about fundraising again? Are you in constant fundraising mode for the inevitable future, or are there times you take some time off and is it kick back up? And I would think, and I've actually seen clients, they get to the point where it gets to be a bit too late, and all of a sudden the leverage shifts dramatically to the current investors who are going to crank you down. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of the things that David just mentioned are very true, and with the caveat, throw the caveat out there that I've worked exclusively in biotech, which is very capital intensive, and mapping out how much money you're going to need to get to some sort of inflection value where it's a phase 2 or you have proof of concept and you're thinking through valuation. I think that I seem to be in my career always thinking about money. Every board meeting, we're always thinking about, okay, well, how is this gonna, how should we be thinking about, how should we be projecting this? How are we thinking about this? And, you're never going, if you've got 4 board meetings a year, you're never going more than, maybe 2 at the most. Maybe you do a round and then 2 later, you're really sort of focusing out, here's where this money's, giving everybody an update, here's where this money is gonna take us. And I think that one of the things that David just mentioned, I think is very critical. I've been part of several companies, which I guess will remain unnamed at this point in time, where the CEO has promised too much and said, it's going to take $25 million for us to get from, this round is going to take us to phase 1, for instance, and not once but twice he's had to go back to the board and say, you know what, it didn't go quite as smoothly as we thought, so we're going to need, to expand that A round, and then the B round is now accelerated earlier. And just like David said, you lose a lot of credibility. And it's important to really map realistically how much money you're going to need. And it is, things happen. It takes longer it takes more money than you think. But to look at it realistically, I think, is a very important conversation to have with your board and your investors. And I think that you got to remember you're going to work with these guys for a long time. And you know, one of the other things that I would mention is that, you know, as you put the syndicate together, it's important to think about, well, who has money, who's got dry powder, who's an evergreen fund, who's not, and so, you know, think about, you know, this is going to be the group of people that you're going to work with for the next couple of rounds, and maybe you bring in another investor to help you along at some point in time, but you're going to work with these people repeatedly, and you need to think about, you know, work together, and I agree, being valuation insensitive is more important than you've got to think through how much money you really need and how you're going to map that out over the next 36 months, if not more. And so we're constantly updating the board. I got a board meeting this week. We're hoping to raise another round. I think it's going to be a tranche. So we're always updating them on where we are, how the progress is. You overlay non-financial issues like how the science is going, so they can think about, okay, well, as we're going to be at this point in time with this amount of money, and they think about valuation and return on their investment, and those are the things that they're thinking about. And everybody, as long as you understand what everybody's trying to think about, then you can all work together and just constantly update them.
And remember, questions are encouraged from the audience, so if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand at any point. Otherwise, David, you and I talked the other day about how to deal with valuation with your friends and family and angels, which is where these companies first see their money, and the concerns that you have seen or issues you've seen around setting that valuation too early or not setting it the right way and what that means. I'd love to get your thoughts on ways to address that.
Yeah, and it's, I think in a lot of areas, there are treacherous shoals to be navigated in the transitions. Whether on a playing field where it's transitioned from defense to offense, or the transitions from round to round. I think one of the reasons that it's really helpful, if you think of the passage of time as the movement from left to right, think from right to left in rationalizing your Gantt chart and your everything that goes into your capital requirements. Because this does a few things. One, it tells you how much am I going to need when, and who are the likely sources of that capital. The other thing that Andrew just said, you're always in fundraising mode. So I think you need to be thinking about what relationships you're going to be able to bring to the table, and you want the people who are at the table already to be motivated to bring relationships to the table, and in a way that doesn't involve tension and gnashing of teeth. So one of the things that often happens is you set a valuation on the company because you want your friends and family to think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you've done too good a job of selling your innovation. And they're thinking they own X of a company worth Y. And then you get a very hard dose of reality when you go out either to a sophisticated angel group or to a venture capital firm that pours cold water all over that, makes you look like an idiot to your friends and family, which can make for some very awkward Thanksgivings with your family. So one of the great mechanisms for that early capital is to not price, to use a convertible note. And that addresses the reality that some of those folks that are putting in early capital aren't necessarily good at valuing, and you give them an incentive of some discount to a round that ultimately gets priced. There are a lot of variations on that theme, but it can sort of smooth things. The other cautionary element is the variability among angels and angel groups is extremely high. There are some that are really good and very sophisticated and good at deals and disciplined about how they do their diligence, and very well connected in terms of follow-on financing. And then there are some who are doing it because, I'm a rich guy, I've made a bunch of money, this is part of my club, and this is what we deal. This is what we do. And that can be a mixed bag, and it also can be extremely disruptive when it comes to negotiating with a venture fund. So I think you need to choose carefully, and also consider from whom you're getting capital, because you can really sort of hoist yourself on your own petard by negotiating too high a valuation early with somebody who's not necessarily going to be as versed in what that valuation ought to look like. And then you create tension there, and then you create tension in the relationship between a couple of your stage investors, where you'd really like them to coexist and get along. Again, it's not science to it. But this is one of the cases where having good advisors like experienced lawyers and experienced folks sort of in your ecosystem. I think another element of choosing angel investors is often finding a really good mentor or some really good mentors who've done what you do. Because the fact of the matter is, you may be a scientist with a great idea. This may be your first startup. So get good advice, get good perspective.
And the angels can open a lot of doors for you, which is often helpful.
I have a question. That dynamic of the transition from solely angel finance to institutional finance is part of what you've been talking about. It's difficult. And one of the dynamics that we sometimes see is that angels feel it's not so much that they disagree with the valuation the institutional guys are proposing, but they feel that some of the assets, there may be multiple assets in the company, that one of them is ripe for commercialization in a way. And damn it, they brought it to this point and you didn't. So how am I going to get my return on the investment on that commercializable piece among the suite of assets we had? And we solved that problem in a recent deal by issuing contingent value rights, CVRs, where we enabled existing angels to, for a limited period, 18 months following our institutional financing, to get a special dividend if that particular asset were commercialized within that time. And that was the bridge to deal or no deal with the institutional guys. It was a fairly large round, and so the stakes are pretty high. Is that a mechanism you've seen before, rewarding the angels for something that's special that's done, so long as it's limited in a way?
So I'm not a big fan, and here's why. I think more than anything, the negotiation at both at the stage of financing and subsequently as a company's built, about what the strategic path is, what the assets are, that what needs to be accomplished in terms of proof point, what needs to be accomplished in terms of some things that can get more nuanced, like sequencing of timing for commercialization of things. I think it is vitally important for everybody to be on the same page there.
Yeah.
Even if it requires some give and take, and even if it doesn't result in everybody getting exactly their way. And you could theoretically create a perverse incentive, or even something that puts management in a place where nobody wants them to be, if you've got the CEOs or whoever is the relevant part of the operating team, CEO plus, who really needs to be focused on this strategic priority, but has an investor who's helped and who's great, who's saying, hey, but I get my little
Yeah.
spiff if you
18
get
months
that
of
done in
non-alignment.
18 months.
Yeah,
So
I
wait
see
a minute, so to me, the better approach is early on, having that conversation and saying, okay, we have these two commercializable assets. We have this in terms of runway, resources, et cetera, et cetera. We got to prove that we can walk before we run with this, and then, but let's all be on board that this is going to get commercialized, assuming this, and this happen, but that's not going to happen for 24 months. But your incentive to do that and have a coherent plan with everybody rowing the, oars going in the same direction, to me, that is an important element.
Yeah.
And I've seen situations with a couple of clients where they have those two potential possibilities, and they go out to investor A with this and investor B with that, and all of a sudden investor A and B get together and say, what the heck's going on, guys? I thought we were investing in this. And so you really do need to deal with that up front and be open and honest about it, because it seems like you're trying to get in money from both sides, but it'll come back to bite you.
And the other aspect there is that can result in a conversation that says, we were originally conceptualizing this as a $3 million round. But if we do this as a $5 million round, we're able to hire X, Y, and Z, or do this with a CRO, whatever's a variation on the theme, to prove out this asset in parallel while we're doing your commercialization here. So I think one of the things that's just critically important is having everybody aligned.
Thank you very much. My question is about the conversation about convertible notes, terms, valuation, too early, not too early. What's the guidance onto when you really need to have your valuation? Is it a certain amount of money? What's driving that going to equity? Some angels are really cool with convertible notes. Some want equity. So what goes into that decision, and what are some pros and cons?
It's not a one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very situational answer. Certainly, when you do your Series A, when you do your institutional round, it's going to get priced.
Mm-hmm.
You may have a variation on the theme where you may have a bridge into it that's not priced that can have some overlap in
So
then the question, you're seeing more and more seed rounds being priced. And you're seeing more and more seed rounds that are being done as common equity, which makes no sense to me. But I think that's a very situational thing.
So Andrew, it's now time for you to talk to David about the equity pool that you need for management. See how much he's willing to give. In terms of the CEOs and founders in the room, that sort of discussion, I think in terms of expectations of what that should be, it's all a battle for talent. How do you approach somebody as gruff and angry as David?
Yeah, I'm afraid to negotiate with David.
And I've known David a long time, so I know that's true, but
Well,
I'll say that.
Yeah.
Well, before you start talking, I like to always come armed with information. We like to go out and get some sort of data that these guys like data put in front of them. They may disagree with the data, which is ultimately, if it's getting them in a place they don't want, they'll say, well, we don't like this data. We'll get different data. I think that putting the founder part aside for a second, because I think that's tied to the initial valuation. But as you think through the growth of the company, the attraction of new talent, and the size of the pool, one of the things that creates a whole bunch of variability is the term of liquidation preference, and whether there's a multiple liquidation preference 1x or no liquidity, just to convert, and so. Those are the things where if you say, okay, well, I've got a 15% pool, but I've got a 2x liquidation preference on top of it, well, your 15% pool is a lot smaller than 15%. So I think, typically, I think 15% is probably a sweet spot, but it does depend on the other terms. And I think that you've got to think about, the management team, the size of the, if if you can use a more CRO model than an in-house model, you're going to use up less equity, and you think through the pool when there's going to be a refresh, and what that refresh is going to look like. And as David said, maybe the team's not going to ball out of the park, so therefore maybe they're going to be maybe this conversation is a little bit easier when all boats are rising. And so I think that it is a very important question to think about the future and the growth of the company. And to echo what David just said about it's easy to get incentives misaligned if you've got certain projects, and I think that keeping everybody aligned, the equity pool helps with that, as long as you're not overcomplicating it or overthinking it, but I think it helps keep everybody aligned.
So, one thing that wasn't mentioned, I actually am a recovering lawyer, so I think back to the early tort classes and how to resolve this. If all else fails, is trial by combat. You just go and duke it out until somebody falls. But I think the big issue, something like an equity pool. Again, equity pools are going to fall into bands. There are. I sort of look at the over-under as 18-20% in an early round that you're going to need, but you need to work through what you're going to need in terms of building a team, and there are bands of here's what we're going to need when we hire that VP business development. Here's what. To me, by the way, one of the perplexing things that companies often do way earlier than they need to do is have a CFO as opposed to a controller, and give away a huge chunk of equity for somebody whose job can really be done outsourced, but that may reflect a bias. But the fact of the matter is you refresh the equity pool when you need to. From the investor's perspective, you want a team that is motivated and is aligned and understands its motivation. The question that has not been raised, that I'm surprised nobody has raised, is, because this is about negotiating term sheets, is out of whose hide does that equity pool come? Is that equity pool put in place the instant before you actually close to come out at a 20% net after number? And that's just something that you'll face along the way, and that's something that is, to me, the more important issue. Some of the other terms, liquidation preference and all, I think that's going to rise and fall on market. And in our cases, in an early round, we're not going to put in a multiple liquidation preference, and then the question is participation and no participation, and assuming a particular multiple, at what point might participation go away. But each of these questions again has context in what's going on in the market at a given time.
I don't like to get involved in the company too early, so CFO is it's a great point. Don't hire a CFO too early. I typically don't get involved with the company until towards the end of the A round. So you can do it with a controller. You really don't need a whole lot of unless you've got something that's extremely complicated or doing some unique structuring of some kind. Really, don't hire a CFO. Don't give away that equity.
And that puts you in the position, on the flip side, that you can actually be doing multiple of these.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
It's
not a full-time CFO position until later on. It's certainly not in the beginning, and you're better off getting some sort of advisory role if you're looking for a CFO. Just get an advisory role for the time being while you're getting these rounds done, and then you don't need to hire one until late, almost at the end of an A.
You want to hire somebody who is experienced.
Yeah.
When you have the person who comes in and everybody's got a C in front of their title, so this guy actually is I'm the techie guy, and my friend went to business school, so we're going to call him the CFO. Why? But and that can vary by company stage, by the way. I mean, in a context in which on your early rounds, you have zero expectation of getting to cash flow. And it is a lot about what kind of partnering deals you're gonna be making, in molecules, for example, where it is a lot of deal making associated with it, where you need somebody who has the understanding and who has the credibility to have done those deals, because some of them get very sophisticated from an overall finance level, as opposed to the sort of the more operational aspect of, okay, so we're managing cash in the bank, et cetera, et
Yeah,
cetera.
and you don't want to hem yourself into a tight spot later,
Exactly.
you know, to think about it, but, I mean, you want your early dollars to be spent on R&D, and that's how you create value. It's not going to create value with the CFO. You know, you just, in some special circumstances, Dave's talking about, yes, but for the most part, you want all those dollars, you want to maximize that R&D spend.
So we've talked a lot about sort of how you can manage these interpersonal discussions, and I think that leads nicely into a discussion also of how do you introduce new members to your board following a financing round, and how do you think about what your board will look like after a round while you're negotiating that round. And I think that has implications not only at the sort of series round with the venture capitalists, but also with the angel investment round. We're seeing, in some cases, especially at seed rounds now, we see people coming into the board earlier than a Series A, but that of course has implications for what your potential venture capital investors are going to be thinking about, how your company runs, what kinds of challenges they may face on the board, what kind of resources that the board brings to the table to find the next round of financing, and who they might want to work with. I'm curious your thoughts, sort of how you negotiate that and how you think about it as you get into the financing.
So, what a board should not be is a context in which people are worried about counting votes on making decisions. At the end of the day, you as the entrepreneur are in a very difficult position if to get decisions done at a board level, you're having to count votes. You want a board that is composed of people who can have robust discussion of your agenda, help you add value to what you're doing with their perspective and their relationships, and then do a very good job of vetting issues that require decisions that ideally are driven by consensus that you as the entrepreneur get increasingly comfortable driving. So I think it is a great mistake. It is troubling to me when I see people who are not adding value but sort of looking to babysit their investment. Some boards you can have just an incredibly destructive, counterproductive thing, when you've got a bad dynamic, when you've got a board member who is either absent. I mean, you want board members to do their homework. You don't want to have Uncle Charlie because he's going to vote your way, okay? And as you move further along, certainly your investors are going to want to have some representation, and certainly your investors are going to want to have some aspects that are reflected in protective provisions, but you should start thinking early on, and everybody needs to get comfortable with the notion that over time you're going to have more and more outside directors on a board. Okay, people that bring something in terms of understanding of what you're trying to do, relationships that you need to exploit, and perspective that animates what you're doing. Ideally, as you're adding outside directors, that's a process that you go through that involves your existing directors. one of the places that can be awkward, but just has to be dealt with, is you have your early board, and maybe that early board needs some upgrades. Maybe some of the folks that were early and had the time and were a little more central to your funding, they stop being voting members of the board. I err on the side of thinking, as long as somebody isn't disruptive and they are adding something and you're not having a three-ring circus, there's really not necessarily a reason not to have those people there continuing a role as observers, because they can add a lot. That generally does not apply to Uncle Charlie, but that can apply to somebody from an angel group who's who adds a lot of value. But I think will tend to accept the reality that the board relationship changes over time. The other thing that is a little away from the term sheet, but it does go to what you need to think about as the entrepreneur. The reality is that you can count the CEOs on one hand who have gone from that early spark of idea and taken a company to the promised land and exit. Okay? Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, and I have trouble coming up with the other three. Okay? So the reality is, because you founded a very successful enterprise, one of the transitions you're going to need to face is, in terms of building the company and managing the company, is there a point at which you're that really good early spark, you're the good technical person, and it should not be an existential crisis that causes you to go and commit seppuku, or worse, get fired because you can't deal with the transition as your board saying, okay, we need now to hire that person who's the person who can get you to commercial stage, or to get you from 50 million to 100 million, or whatever is the particular metric. So you need to be thinking about those things relative to, and you need to approach that with courage. You need to have a board that is going to help you through that transition. Ideally, you're going to have a board that's also going to be able to mentor you through that process to get you to maximize your growth and learning curve and your success curve. Because the fact of the matter is, some people can become that Bill Gates, or you don't need to make Microsoft, but you can be that person who's able to really move the needle and keep on growing through the life cycle of the company. But that's how I would think about it.
Thanks, David. And that gets us to 10:50 and the end of our time today. But I wanted to thank David, Andrew, and Jonathan for joining today, and everyone for coming in this morning. I really appreciate it. I think it was a great panel.